talked to Sir Walter Scott.
But was Scott largely benefited by a major revival of Scottish nationalism?
He caused it. He brought it about, yeah.
It's his own darn fault, eh?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And then he wrote himself to death, which is...
What was his last work? Do you know?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
Oh, really? Okay, you rolling?
Yep.
Okay. The first Spring Thaw featured some talented folks
Oh, yes.
in it.
Yes.
It was from the New Play Society, I understand.
I think so, yes.
Could you tell me some of the folks that were...
I was never connected directly with the Spring Thaw, but naturally I knew all the people. I can certainly tell you stories about it, including one that I'm afraid we won't be able to use, which is Father Best's story. And that was Don Harron, who was doing a blackout. Blackouts are very short sketches, very short items done in front of a curtain to allow them to change sets behind, so you need to have a supply of blackouts. And Don was dressed as a clergyman for this blackout, and what he was doing was looking through a convention. It was a clergyman's convention in Toronto, and Monday we're doing this, Tuesday we're doing that, and so forth, and finally at the end, Sunday, nothing on there, never anything to do in Toronto on a Sunday. Blackout, you know. That's fine. But while he was hanging around backstage, there were kids out the back making noises and sort of, you know, deliberately shouting and banging things, maybe 13 or 14-year-olds, that sort of age, you know. And Don said, "I'll fix it," and went out and opened the stage door at the back into the alley with his outfit on. And said, boys, and they all sort of came up. Said, "Boys, are any of you boys in my parish?" And they said, no, sir. And Don said, "Good, then fuck off."
You did lyrics for a song.
Good story, eh?
I know. You might bleep the word. You did the words, however, for Spring Thaw. We all hate Toronto.
No, that wasn't for Spring Thaw.
Was it not?
No, that was one of the stage series.
Oh, okay. Could you tell me then about that very song and what brought it on and what?
Well, there were a lot of songs in that thing. We All Hate Toronto was the title of the whole thing, and it was the pitch was simply that the great unifying force of the country is that we all hate Toronto. You know, people go to Toronto, and furthermore, everyone is from out of town. So there was, you know, little gags like that. The song which Lucio wrote, I think the words were fairly commonplace. Every Monday morning, business starts again, or something like that. But Lucio wrote a wonderful tune to it. And it was the catchiness of those tunes. I wrote quite a lot of satirical things like that. One which was performed a lot, and All About Emily has been performed a lot. And All About Emily is about the goose that laid the golden egg. And of course, that tells you that you know, what we do is kill the goose that lays. So there's a little point in most of these things.
Who did you collaborate with for the musical?
Well, nobody. Nobody. Lucio, of course. You know, in other words, I wrote some lyrics and passed it to Lucio, and Lucio looked at it and said, "Oh, well, I can get a tune out of this, can't I?" Godfrey Rideout collaborated in a musical version of The Blood is Strong, and The Blood is Strong has been done several times in musical versions. It seems to work well. It also seems to work well in the stage version. It's, you know, there's not a dry seat in the house, I think, by the time it's finished.
Could you call yourself a part-time librettist?
Well, librettist isn't quite the word. I've written a lot of verse plays, and some of them have been very successful. Very successful by the standards of my work, you know. Encounter by Moonlight was very successful. Return to Colonus was successful. That was a retelling in modern version and modern verse of the latter part of the story of Oedipus. There are 3 or 4 lines in one of my verse plays which I certainly remember, because I once shared a course at UBC by sharing, of course, I gave half the lectures and W.H. Auden gave the other half. And we sort of alternated, and it was an extraordinary experience in a summer session. Auden read one of these plays, he read that one, and said he enjoyed it very much. And he said, not only that, it contains 3 or 4 lines of poetry. That's not the same as verse. He always distinguished between verse and poetry, and he said that he himself wrote very few lines of poetry, and he felt that Shakespeare, for example, in Hamlet, there's very few lines of poetry, but much great verse. That's something different. And the lines had to do with the fall coming on. And the sugars and the leaves changing the colour and all the rest of it. And the lines are, but now this Eden fears another fall. I get it right, I've forgotten it. But now this Eden fears another fall. The hill bleeds sweet with the lovely blood of the maple. The guilt of golden time is rich on golden ash. The hill bleeds sweet with the lovely blood of the maple. I think really hit it. It's luck, every so often something goes right.
Beautifully Canadian. Tell me, how did you come to contribute to the Jupiter? How did that come along?
Same thing, they asked me to do something. The Socrates was a big success, and it might be, because Frank Peddy played Socrates, of course looked like Socrates. He had this sort of bashed around kind of face. He looked as if he'd slept in his face, and that's a great help. There was a prologue. The prologue was Lorne Greene, who was one of the organisers of the Jupiter Theatre. One of the main characters, one of the most impressive characters, was a kid from Montreal who had just come to town. It was his first appearance on the stage, Chris Plummer. Yeah, exactly. There was a cast there that you couldn't buy a few years later. There wasn't enough money in show business to buy that cast.
And was this possibly at that point the most glittering opening that you might have attended of your own work?
I suppose so. Yes. There were no glittering openings much. I mean, there wasn't the kind of thing that we see in the Festival of Festivals. The opening was, when the show went on, and mostly people were running around in circles worrying about things. There was not much in the way of glitter, but there was a lot of support. We supported each other very well. There was no question about that. The people who were on the outside weren't. I would say that the critics were on the outside and often wanted to remain so. It still happens, of course, and we still have people who are suitably broken-hearted about criticisms. And I like to say, if it's upsetting you very much, what you should do is go and write graffiti on the critic's statue. And they say, but what critic statue? And I said, right, there are no statues to critics. Actors, yes. Playwrights, yes. Critics, no.
Nathan Cohen panned your play as not Canadian, The Man in Blue Moon.
Yes.
Yeah. Criticism often hurt the crest. Did that hurt you?
Nathan and I had an ambivalent relationship. Nathan also seemed to like quite a lot of my things. We sort of went back and forth and all those. He wrote a play which was diabolically awful, and I was asked to review it. And I said that I would review it on condition that I was allowed to review it as I wished. I would not be malicious, but I would certainly tell the truth about it. And it was a dreadful play. Blue is for Morning, I think it was called. It was threatened as the first part of a trilogy, and he never finished it off. He was not a playwright. He was actually a very good editor, incidentally. He was a good script editor. but that's not the same as being a playwright. It's a function that somebody has to do, and very often the author writes the play, and then you have to sort of change hats and go to work and edit your own play. A name we haven't mentioned, and I think we should, is Pierre Burton, who is responsible for a lot of the Spring Thaw stuff. And Pierre, who is now celebrated, of course, as a historian, and there's a Pierre Burton Prize and all the rest of it. But Pierre has always been a cut-up, and he's always been very good on comedy and very fond of comedy. And he's perhaps my oldest friend. And I would say, like me, he's an omnibrow. He's interested in anything, and he's always forever interested. Very, he never seems to get jaded, and I think that's the fatal disease, is being jaded.
We don't often associate him with drama, at least not nowadays. Drama per se, script, stage.
Well, he wrote skits for Spring Thaw, and they were very successful and very funny. He has a deadly eye, a deadly aim on these sort of things. He's also, by the way, a very good cartoonist.
Have to find some of those. The transformation of the Canadian stage after the war, we're talking about a period, I think, when Roberts and Davies emerged.
Yeah.
It meant that playwrights like Davies, for the first time, had access to professional rather than amateur stages and amateur companies. What was that period like in terms of the readjustment from the pre-war to the post-war stage period? Was it a major revolution, or?
No, it wasn't. It was more of a transformation of the Dominion Drama Festival. That would be a fairer way of putting it. It was taking place imperceptibly, but gradually you began to notice that the Dominion Drama Festival had become professional. It was that sort of thing, and it was still hard to make a living. You made a living by leaving town, and then of course the Stratford Festival made a very big difference, and then later the Shaw Festival. It became accepted. But even with the Stratford Festival, there have been problems. The problems are, who wants to see Canadian actors? There hasn't been anything like enough reciprocity. The Canadian Conference of the Arts, which I was connected with for many years, has always pushed for reciprocity. Simply saying whatever conditions are required of Canadian actors going into the United States or Great Britain, which is also very tough to get into, why don't we do the same? We don't. I mean, they can come in all right. We can't. And if you raise a fuss about it, it's quite interesting. There are enough people who will say, well, come on, what the hell? I mean, we always want to see the great actors of the world who are American and British. I mean, why would they particularly want to see Canadians? To which I think you can reply, if the Canadians are so mild and feeble, why are they so keen on keeping them out? What's the problem there? And of course there are a lot of Canadians now have got their green cards, but there is this quite elaborate process that has to be gone through.
Perhaps it's partly that the producers like the sure thing of bringing in a Brit and saying, well, we bring in Gielgud, we bring in Mason, and we'll pack it. Yeah,
the audience is like it. The audience, especially for Stratford, is the hinterland from which they draw the audience, has a lot from Detroit in it. Something which I would like to mention was a series that was done by Andrew and by me mainly, and by Len Peterson somewhat, for the Ford Foundation. And there were two quite elaborate series. One was 2 series on anthropology called The Ways of Mankind, done with Walter Goldschmidt, who's at UCLA, and they were all done in Canada with Canadian actors and Canadian scripts, because the Ford Foundation people felt that we could do the job best, and I think they were absolutely right. And those programs are still being used. They're used in universities and schools all over the place, the Ways of Mankind series. And there were 2 13-week series of those, and that was followed by a long series on Alexis de Tocqueville. And the Tocqueville series has also been used a great deal. I wrote all the Tocqueville ones. And, with George Probst, who is, of course, a Tocqueville authority. And there were wonderful performances. There's no question. Barry Morse played the lead. Can't lose with Barry.
The test pattern. They used to call him the CBC's test pattern. That's his nickname, because he was on everything.
Yeah.
So you seem not to distinguish too much between enlightening drama and enlightening true, real facts, right? True stories and fiction, for you, would you say that's fairly interchangeable in terms of your desire to do that?
Yeah, I do try, mind you, to distinguish which is which, you know. I think that's fairly important. It's like saying, in Kipling's If, you know, it says, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. Treating them just the same is one thing, not knowing which is another. You have to be able to distinguish. But I would regard enlightenment as being something which applies either to fact things or to drama or to fiction, to all these whole areas. What I'm very conscious of all the time is mythology. I believe very strongly in myths, and myth is a word which I think is very much misused. People say if something is a myth, you know, it's only a myth, it's something that's not true. And to be told that some of the stories of Christianity or Buddhism or something are myths, then they're not really true. I think it's exactly the other way around. The essence of a myth is it's a story that is true. And what's true about it is it has psychological truth and cultural truth and social truth, and it's validating all those feelings. And a myth is a kind of flow in time, and you could make a cross section. You can do a freeze frame, and then you get an icon, which symbolizes, like the great icons of the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary that she's pregnant. You know, that's an icon which appears over and over again as part of a myth. Well, myths are sometimes historically true and sometimes they're not, but what makes them valid and important is that they are saying something valuable and enlightening. And that's the key thing about it. And I think all good writing, all writing should be attempting to do that. And our great writers, and we have many great writers in Canada, and what makes them great is precisely their mythological content.
So people are against myths, myth the point, I understand. The well-known Ted Allan left Canada to go to Britain.
Yep.
Did you work much with Ted?
Work with is, you know, writers don't work with each other, so to speak. You know, they pass like ships in the night. I admired a lot of Ted's work very much. There was a kind of turmoil many years ago in the union, in ACTRA, the mine mill and smelter workers.
Sorry about that, Mr. Nancy. Could you stop tape, please? I don't remember either. Where were we? Sorry? What was the last sentence? Yeah. Hold on. Okay, the turmoil, do you recall where we were?
Yes, there was a turmoil in the union, in the Actors Union, because there was a takeover bid by the mine, mill and smelter workers. And the mine, mill and smelter workers in those days were communist-controlled or communist-sympathized in the days when there were such things as communists, in particular when there were fellow travelers and things of that kind. And there seemed to be a kind of fellow traveler move. And some of us thought that was a bad idea, and some thought it was a good idea. And there was a fairly ferocious discussion, and in the end we opted for the union controlling itself. And kind of mysteriously, the people who had been supporting the takeover evaporated. when the feeling of the meeting was going against them, they stopped speaking, you know. So that was very interesting.
Just faded away.
Yes, for the time being.
Can we talk a little about the vigil for John Draney, the last period, the whole idea of the film and so forth? What happened?
Well, I was executive producer of a series called Man at the Centre, and I was doing biographies. I wanted to do biographies of the John Draney Award winners. There's a John Draney Award, which is given every year. It's voted on by the people who already hold it. So it's for some kind of lifetime achievement and significance in broadcasting. And John Draney, I wanted to do, of course, himself. He was by then dying. He had cancer, and in particular by then he had cancer of the lungs. He wanted to do it, however. He was very determined to do this. There were various things he wanted to do. He wanted to do certain scenes and certain parts that he'd done. Part of Mr. Ocularis, for example, by Conrad Aiken. I think he wanted to do that. He wanted to sing. He wanted to sing a catch with his daughters, and the various things of that kind. But he was taking heavy doses of drugs to stop the coughing of the lung cancer. And the way it was set up, his colleagues, our colleagues, behaved quite extraordinarily. We couldn't really say when John would be ready to do a scene. But we could say, and if he would say, I'm feeling pretty good now, let's do the scene. Well, you could not then say, okay, let's do the scene, we'll get on the phone and send for Barry, one particularly, or Fletcher, who was, where they all were was round the corner, just out of sight, sitting in cars, eating hamburgers, and waiting to be called in. We didn't want them out front, because John, didn't want to look out front, so everyone's sitting around waiting for me, and he was very conscious, I want to keep going, not to keep them waiting. So nobody was waiting, apparently. So we say, we'll be able to get them, And sure enough, suddenly, there they were,
There was a film.
There was the film, yeah.
Tell about that a little bit.
Well, the camera was there. We just made, every time we got something, we were shooting over a period of about 3 days, because we were doing it in little episodes, and then John would rest for a bit. And he would talk a bit, and then we would do a scene and so on. We never did shoot the third day because he died in the night. And we were able to say that in the film. And his performance in the film is just as good as ever it was. He's quite extraordinary. He was also extraordinary in all kinds of ways. He was absolutely the legitimate object of anecdotes. He worked extremely hard. His scripts are extraordinary because every one of them is underlined. Every word is underlined, has a marker on it of some kind to indicate exactly how he wanted to do it. And he was wonderful to work with. And incidentally, I've never yet found an actor who let me down. Many a time an actor has pulled me up, but they've never let me down. I mean, actors I have great admiration and respect for, and particularly people like John Draney and Bud Knapp and these people. Draney, however, was always off in a corner working and practicing and reading things. And he never paid any attention to the clock. And we're going on live, of course, and it kind of mattered, And one day, on one famous occasion, Draney had decided he'd go to the washroom because he didn't have a watch. And there he was in the washroom, working, of course, as usual. And, the cue came up, and there it was. There was one line from Bernie Braden on this was in the McGill Street studio, which was a stage in an old theatre, and no Draney, who was going to reply. And Fletcher Markle, who was very quick on the uptake, we were sitting in the audience, another actor from Vancouver, Al Pearce, also very quick on the uptake, spotted what had happened. Fletcher remembered what the line was and called out the line, and he shouted the line from the auditorium and said, whatever the line is, I'll be right with you in a moment, and came down fast down the aisle. And Al Pearce, who had a very cool, laid-back way, just quietly held up the script. And Fletcher took the script as he went by and appeared and did the scene, the teaser scene, and then Draney appeared, sort of looking, And Andrew then got very stern about it and said, really cut out the crap, John. You're going to have to buy a watch. You're going to have to get a watch and wear it. So, John bought a watch. And about 6 months later, some question of time came up, and Andrew said, what time is it, And this really happened. I was really standing there. And John said, well, I think it's about 25 to 2. And Andrew said, why don't you look at your watch and find out? And Draney said, well, I'm afraid the hands have come off it. And for about a month he'd been walking around with a watch with the hands rattling around in the bottom. That's old Draney. The greatest of all radio actors ever in the world. And all the Americans, the British, the Germans, everyone recognized that. And we should always remember it.
Who were the ladies that played opposite Draney?
Ruth Springford was one. Ruth Springford is still very active and is a wonderful performer, of course. Fran Hyland has played all these important and big parts. Nonnie Griffin has played many parts. Nonnie Griffin worked her way through my play The Blood is Strong, beginning as the daughter and winding up as the mother, showing the play has survived a fair length of time. She survived. She could still play the daughter as far as I'm concerned, but nonetheless, that's the sort of thing that happens there.
How about some of the other players then, men?
Bud Knapp was an extraordinary performer, quite remarkable. He spent a little time in England, but his proper home, I think, was in Canada, and he played very well. Frank Peddy played the lead in a great many of my plays. His style of acting was one that suited my feeling. He was a character actor of great natural weight, so he was wonderful as Oedipus in the Return to Colonus, which was a modern version. He was wonderful, of course, as the Scottish father. He was wonderful as Socrates in all these parts, and there were many, many more. He was wonderful as Captain Smith, one in a play I wrote called One John Smith, which is about Captain Smith and Pocahontas, the guy who first showed up there. So I'd certainly, his sons became involved in broadcasting too, Dave Petty and Jim.
What is your favorite radio play that you've written?
I think my favorite radio play is actually a nativity play. I wrote a nativity play for agnostics, and it's called The View from Here is Yes. And what it's about, essentially, it makes a point which I think is a very important point, namely that this is a very familiar story. It's one of the stories, one of the very few nowadays, in which we can take advantage of dramatic irony. And the essence of that is, of course, that the audience knows what's coming. So that's one of the few we can do that. So where are the surprises? And you can say, well, we know there are no surprises in all these areas. There are no surprises, but there's one very big surprise. Who is going to be Herod this time round? That's the one you've got to keep your eye open for. Watch out for Herod.
Yeah, new tape, eh? We're going to our last tape now, so I'm going to be wrapping it up in the next couple of pages of questions here.